Hello, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm your moderator for today, Clara Davison. Thank you so much for joining us for our third book club. Today, we will discuss Beloved by Toni Morrison, selected because it was one of the most recommended titles by more than 100 Department of English alumni who shared their top 10 book lists earlier this year. A big thank you to our Department of English faculty, Associate Professor Koritha Mitchell, and Distinguished University Professor, Director of Medical Humanities, and Director of Project Narrative, Jim Phelan, for sharing their expertise with us today. We are recording this webinar, and we will share the video in a follow-up email with all of you. Attendees know that you are muted and your video is off. If you have a comment or question to add to the conversation, you can share by typing or by speaking. If you would like to type, click Q&A at the bottom of your screen and submit your comment or question. If you would like to speak, click Raise Hand at the bottom of your screen. I will enable your audio and then call on you by name. A pop-up to unmute your microphone, just your microphone. Your video will not be turned on. You'll see a pop-up that will appear in the center of your screen. You'll click OK to unmute yourself, and then you can share your remark. So we already have about 60 attendees on this webinar, so we will not be able to respond to every comment or question, but we will do our best to address as many as possible. So to get us started, Jim and Koritha will share some brief remarks about Beloved, including responses to some of your pre-submitted questions. After the remarks, we will open up the conversation. So again, you can submit your questions and comments by clicking Q&A to type or raise hand to speak. Jim, take it away.
Okay, thanks. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending. I'm delighted to be doing this with Koritha. I just want to start with a few observations and then talk a little bit about how I've responded to the book and some of my students have. I think it's worth noting that in 2006, the New York Times Book Review did a survey of contemporary critics and novelists, asking them to rank the best American novels of the last 25 years. And the book that emerged as #1 was Toni Morrison's Beloved. And I think that captures something both about the power of the book and about its influence. This is a book that has, I think, changed the course of American fiction, among other things. So it's great that you're here and that we're all talking about it. I read it shortly after it came out, and I was just deeply, deeply moved. The experience of reading Toni Morrison's Beloved just sort of lived with me as I was doing it and after I was doing it for a long time. And and so I started teaching it. And a few things have sort of emerged that I want to sort of focus or foreground for our discussion. What are some of those things that seem to be central to the power of the book? The first, I think, is that it's a historical novel. And it's a historical novel about, America's abiding sin, right? Slavery. And it's about, but it's a historical novel which is very much interested in both the past and the present. One of the things that's, maybe we can talk about in more detail later, is the way in which the book sort of frames the telling as in 1987, right? Morrison says early on, the narrator says, Ohio had been calling itself a state for only 70 years, when first one brother and the other packed up and left 124 Bluestone Road, right? And that suggests, right, where's the narrator locating if she's thinking that 70 years is a relatively short time, right? So I think it's interesting to think about her as located in the present. And then, so that provides a general kind of temporal perspective. And then at the end of the novel, when Morrison's narrator talks about the story, when this was a story not to pass on, this is a story not to pass on, and that she is, I think, really inviting us to think about the relevance of this for the present. And then again, something else that we can get into. I think that the second thing that's really significant and crucial to the power is the character of Beloved herself. The dominant image that we get of her is that she is the sort of the returned child, right? 18 years later, after Setha had taken the saw to her neck, and she comes back in this form. But there's also, Morrison is doing other things and making other suggestions, right? Linking her with slaves who came over on the Middle Passage, suggesting that, well, maybe, that the ghostly kind of reading isn't the only reading, that she embeds the story of a woman who has escaped from basically the basement of some white man in Cincinnati. And so who is Beloved, and how do we get a handle on her? For us as readers, I think that's really important, and it also kind of mirrors some of what's going on in the novel, right, for the characters. And when we think about the different responses that Paul D. and Setha and Denver have, who is this? So that central thing is something that I think you can live with as you read it. And then the last one I'll mention is the sort of the ethical dilemma at the core of the novel, the thing to which I think the whole first half kind of leads up to, and then the second half sort of follows from, and that is Setha's decision, right, to kill her child rather than have her go back to slavery. And it is there's multiple dimensions of it, but at the core, it's this kind of ethical decision. What is, what is the good in this horrible situation? And Setha has to make that decision, and she makes it in one way. And then Morrison asks us to come to terms with it ourselves. What do we think of it? And it's, I think, quite striking that she tells the story of the decision three different ways. One from the perspective of the slave catchers, one from Stampede's perspective, and one from Setha's perspective herself. And it's, again, we can talk some more about it, but I would sort of say, in general, Morrison wants to sort of involve us in the complexity of that decision, and keep us in that complexity without resolving it for us. And I think that too adds tremendously to the power of the novel. So I'll stop there.
Oh, okay. Well, this is really, really wonderful to share this space with you, this virtual space with you, Jim. I am grateful to all of the organizers for making this happen, and, you know, just kind of really dwelling in the fact that this is the anniversary of Morrison joining the ancestors, that we are gathering here to speak about this. So of course, that's kind of just put me in the mindset of really thinking about all of the things that Morrison and her work has meant to me over the years. And I won't go on too long, but I do want to begin by sharing that in 1993, when she was awarded the Nobel Prize, I was a sophomore in college, actually up the street at Ohio Wesleyan University. I'm originally from Texas, so the fact that I ended up in Ohio for undergrad and again in my first job after the PhD is kind of interesting, but I won't digress on that. But basically, the fact that she won the Nobel Prize in 1993 ended up being a really important moment for me in my journey, because what basically happened is in my very favorite English class with my very favorite English professor, a guest speaker was brought in, and that guest speaker basically said, you know, can we name the people who have won the Nobel Prize? And so people started naming people. And then he said, do we know who won it this year? And the answer was Toni Morrison. And he said, well, yes, of course, it's a good time to be Black and a woman. And so, you know, to have that experience as a sophomore English major was really important, because as time went on and Morrison's work inspired my desire to go to graduate school, I really had to think about, okay, if that is the kind of thing that people will say about an amazing talent like Toni Morrison, what are they going to say about me? What is my path in the United States as someone who is not a straight white man, who is trying to make a life that is about writing and reading? If that's how Toni Morrison is being discussed, surely I will encounter at least that kind of opposition. But the reason Toni Morrison made me want to go to graduate school is because in another English class, I was being introduced to all of the ways that women's literature, and that's how the class was framed, women's literature was suppressed. And throughout the semester, I kept thinking, all of these examples are things that happen to authors who aren't white. But my professor never addressed that at all. And I didn't have the confidence or the words or anything to bring it up. But I just kept thinking, why is it that we don't acknowledge that this is why literature by people of color isn't part of what we're doing either? But we get to the end of the class, and it didn't matter that I never brought that up, because the very last text we read in that class was The Bluest Eye. And it absolutely changed my life. because it was the first time that I realized that the experiences that I had had up until that point were not simply because I am treated certain ways because I'm Black. I'm also treated certain ways because I'm both Black and female. And that book opened all of that up for me and made all kinds of things possible for me. So as I think about Beloved, Beloved is certainly a text that, for me, as all of Morrison's work and as all great literature, right? It's about so many different things, so many different things. And so the way that I'll focus my comments today on Beloved is really to think in terms of what I think Morrison is doing in this book, about the fact that, as she said, there isn't even a bench by the road to acknowledge slavery as something that happened, right? That there are no monuments to the slave experience, not even a bench by the road, she says. And when I take Beloved as her response to that lack of a bench by the road, then part of what it allows me to do is think about the way that she is writing in a way that addresses a kind of recovery of our understanding of slavery, a kind of recovery of it that is very much male-centered. And so here, in some ways, I'm thinking about Roots in the 70s and how Alex Haley's Roots, both as a book and as a mini series on television, part of the way that it tried to make sure that the country reckoned with slavery was in part kind of influenced by a Black power aesthetic that was trying to recenter Black men as having the agency that we should understand them having, even under a brutal regime like slavery. And I see Beloved as one way that Morrison is saying, well, how is it that we can think about Black women's experiences in slavery and make sure that we're doing some honoring of that experience? So one way that I understand this book is, Morrison always talked about the importance for her of minimizing the white gaze, right? She talked about how James Baldwin and she would joke about how there's this little white man on your shoulder looking over everything you write, and how she was invested in trying to get rid of that little man on her shoulder. And so if I look at Beloved in a way that thinks about how she got rid of feeling constrained by what white readers would think, and was able to give herself the space of really honoring Black communities, right? Part of that honoring includes the kinds of tensions that are happening in the Black community, right? So one of the things that seems so powerful to me is to think about Beloved as a love story, to think about the way that Setha and Paul D are trying to choose each other and running up against problems with that choosing each other. And a big part of why they have those problems is because of all of the violence that they have been made to experience in their lives, because slavery is the thing that shaped their lives. And so for me, this book has really been a powerful way to think about what would it be like to read this book in terms of how Morrison is thinking through Setha's definitions of success. How does she change her definitions of success over time, depending upon what's going on? And it feels to me like part of the central tensions that we see here is Setha's belief that you can't, as a Black woman, choose to love equally children and a partner of your choosing. the United States has made it such that, okay, maybe we'll deal with Black women's love for their children, but I'll be damned if I'm gonna let you choose the person that you mate with, right? That slavery is all about breeding Black women, whether it's white men raping you or making Black men rape you, right? And Sethe definitely has that in her past, because we have that moment where she's talking about the woman who tells her about her mom. And it's like, you know, I want you to know that she named you, and she actually put her arms around that man, your father, right? So Morrison keeps it unclear as to whether the crew that raped her and the woman that's telling Sethe this story, she keeps it unclear as to whether that crew is white men or Black men. But she does make sure that Sethe knows she put her arms around that one and she gave you a name. So Sethe in adulthood is not sure that she can choose both to love a man and her child, but having seen that glimpse of her mother having chosen by putting her arms around that man, having seen that glimpse, I would say, is the reason why she wants to at least try. So when Paul D shows up, it really is about her trying to figure out, can I do both? Do I have love enough for both? And at different points, sometimes she thinks that even though she has enough love for all, that one or the other will make you choose, right? Beloved seems to be making her choose. Denver seems to be making her choose. At other points, Paul D is making her choose. So I'll stop there for now.
Sorry, you're muted.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you both for your insightful opening remarks. We'll open up the conversation now. Attendees, please know that closed captioning is available, so you can click closed captioning at the bottom of your screen to view those subtitles. To submit questions, again, you can type by clicking Q&A or click raise hand, and then I will unmute you and you can share your question by speaking. So our first question is from Susan. She asks, can you please comment on the use of the ghost story? Why use this rather than a linear chronological pattern to storytelling? Is the ghost story needed because the story is a lot of horror?
Is the ghost story needed because, just say
because the story is about a lot of horror.
Oh. Do you want to go or?
I'll let you.
Okay. Well, I think that part of what's going on is one of the things that Koritha talked about was the way in which Sethe is trying to define success, right? And one of the things that Morrison is really interested in is the trauma of slavery, right? So, and it's I think pretty obvious, but also important to underline the fact that the two main temporal frames for the events are 1873 and 1855. So 1855 is slavery, right? 1873 is post-Civil War, post-emancipation, right? And so the sort of the present time of the historical is 1873, right? But that 1873 is deeply affected by the trauma of 1855 and the whole slave experience, right? So one of the definitions of success that Sethe has in 1873 is beating back the past, right? And that's a definition of success that's not sustainable, right? And so one of the very powerful ways in which Morrison both represents the trauma and the unsustainability of the idea of beating back the past is to have that past sort of become re-embodied or embodied again in this figure of beloved, right? And then that has all kinds of consequences for the way in which Setha responds. You know, and it doesn't, then of course it does affect, as Koritha was saying, you know, the other thing that's happens in 1873 is the return of Paul D into her life, right, after 18 years. And that's going in a certain kind of trajectory that's quite positive, right? And then Beloved shows up, right? There's all this initial sort of tension and instability when Paul D shows up between the new triangle, right? So first thing that he does is he chases the ghost out of 124, right? And that's really significant. And then that creates the space for Paul D and Setha and Denver to sort of work some things out, right? And they have this moment where they go to the, you know, the little carnival, right? And it all seems to be clicking, right? And then they come back and there's this woman who seems to have come out of the water, right? And it's Beloved. And it's like, here's the past come, you know, let's deal with it. And I think then, you know, all these things about, well, who is Beloved? How do the characters relate to her? How do the readers relate to her? All that is sort of deeply enhanced by the idea that the past has returned in her form, even if that's not all that she is.
So good. Yes. All of that. All of that. And I think, you know, I think part of what, so when I talk about Beloved in the book of mine that's about to come out, it's called From Slave Cabins to the White House, Homemade Citizenship in African American Culture. It drops literally in a couple days. But when I talk about Beloved in that book, it's in chapter 5, which I call Still the Master's House, ? And so it has everything to do with what Jim is phrasing as beating back the past. Because the question, or what I think is happening, is that there's a working out of, can you engage the past without having it determine your future? And that's actually what is happening between Paul D and Setha. Setha gives Paul D room to acknowledge his past, but not have his future be determined by it. She gives him that space by allowing him to tell what he tells and not judging him. He has questions himself about his own manhood, but Setha doesn't. And so she gives him the space to acknowledge his past without having his future limited by it. When he has an opportunity to return the favor, he is not able to do that. And instead, he counts her feet. You have 2 feet, Setha, not 4, as he judges her and what she did. And so for my money, the issue is, can you acknowledge your past and not have it determine your future? And that is the question that I think, as you said, Beloved in all of her different forms forces people to grapple with. But I want to add this other part to it, because part of what, you know, that I love that phrase, beating back the past, because so much of what Setha is grappling with is what she calls hateful pictures, the hateful pictures that white violence has put in the minds of Black people who have been brutalized, right? So there's this one moment, and I'm in this edition. I don't know if this might be the edition that other people have, but I just want to read this moment because it was one of those moments that for me goes to the heart of what you're talking about. And if we want to think about it in terms of beating back the past or grappling with the past, like however we're going to think about it, this is one of those moments where Setha is thinking through, and she says, And this is also linked to what you were talking about, Jim, in terms of them going to the carnival, right? And they're like holding hands, and there's a possibility of something real, right? And Paul D says, we can have a life, girl, a life, right?
Right.
And it seemed that the glimpse of happiness she caught in the shadows, swinging hands on the road to the carnival, was a likelihood. If she could just manage the news Paul D brought, and the news he kept to himself, just manage it, not break, fall, or cry each time a hateful picture drifted in front of her face, not develop some permanent craziness like Baby Suggs's friend, a young woman in a bonnet whose food was full of tears, like Aunt Phyllis, who slept with her eyes wide open, like Jackson Till, who slept under the bed. All she wanted was to go on, and she had. Alone with her daughter in a haunted house, she managed every damn thing. Why now, with Paul D, instead of the ghost, was she breaking up, getting scared, needing baby? The worst was over, wasn't it? And so for me, this is one of those moments where we really grapple with what you're talking about, Jim, right? Like, if I'm going to make a future, if I'm going to, acknowledge the fact that I can't leave this past, as I'm trying to figure out, is this still the master's house? Even though I'm free, is this still the master's house? Is what has been done to me still going to determine everything about my house? It has for other people who found freedom. They're having tears in their food. She goes through those three examples. And so for me, this is a moment where we really get to grapple with, what does it mean to try to make a new life and freedom? And there are all different kinds of examples. And part of what Seth is doing is thinking through what those examples are and how she's going to determine what hers will be. So I guess, I'm not leaving the question behind, because to me, everything that Jim said about how Beloved functions in this text as bringing back the past and having us grapple with the past is exactly what Morrison wants us all to grapple with.
Our next question from Ileana: could you talk about the role of the erotic between Setha, Denver, and Beloved? In what ways is Morrison exploring important sexual slash sensual tensions between Black mothers and daughters, or perhaps within Black motherhood, and the erotic connection to one's children? Erotic here not meaning sexual as in sex, but sexual as in sensual slash pleasurable bond.
I mean, I can venture a thought or two and then give it to Jim and then maybe come back because I'll just kind of go. The first thing that comes to mind for me from that question is the way that the text has us grapple with Denver's loneliness. There's a way in which, let me see if I wrote it down, because it really struck me, reviewing for this, the way that we have to grapple with Denver's loneliness and the way that she is not wanting Beloved to disappear. And so for me, when you bring up the erotic, that's one of the first things that comes to mind. And so let's see, I did write it down. Okay, I clearly wrote down the wrong page number, so never mind.
Well, I would say, just pick up on what Koritha is saying about Denver's loneliness. There's also what's striking to me is this kind of rivalry that develops, or at least Denver sees a rivalry between herself and her mother in relationship to Beloved once Beloved comes, right? And there's also a little bit of a rivalry, which is maybe totally expected, for the affection of of Setha in relationship to Paul D on Denver's part, right? And then I would say that sort of one of the trajectories of the novel is then, and I would add that I would agree that there's a kind of erotic dimension in the way that you're defining erotic, Ileana, to the Denver Setha relationship. But then one of the trajectories is the way in which Denver, kind of loses the competition with Beloved, especially after Paul D leaves, right? And then part of Setha's response to that is to turn to Beloved and try to, expiate as whatever, or, her sense of can I make it up to you, and do whatever she wants, and Beloved becomes this figure who kind of, dominates Setha's life, and Denver loses in that way. But what's so remarkable is that she figures out she needs to act on her own, right? She needs to sort of take control of her own life, and she gets out of 124 and starts moving beyond it. And that also opens up another kind of possibility about not being bound by the past in the way that Koritha was talking about, right? It's another track upon which Morrison is exploring that. So I hope that helps, at least in some way, to respond to the question.
Our next question is from Paul. Would you comment on the generational story? Baby Suggs, Setha, and finally Denver are three women connected through Haley. The novel ends in one respect, with Denver coming into herself, and she is so much a descendant of both her grandmother and her mother.
Yeah, I think just to start, I think one of the things that's really striking and picking up on what Koritha was saying in her opening remarks about the focus on women, right? The slave woman's story, right? 124, for 18 years, is primarily a woman's space, right? Baby Suggs, Setha, Denver. The men, right, the two boys, Howard and Butler, leave, right? And so there is this focus on, the three generations of women and how they are sort of coping with the traumatic past, right? And then when Paul D comes, then we have the insertion of the male presence, and we've talked some about the complications for that. But I think, Morrison sort of sets the three women up in really kind of in a complicated relationship. It sort of gives them different kinds of agency and sets them up as sort of different people or characters for us to relate to, right? So Baby Suggs is the kind of sage, right? And she has this power to preach and so on. And she's somebody that Setha can turn to and Denver can turn to and so on. And going back to something I said earlier, one of the things about the ethical judgment, right? Morrison lets us know that Baby Suggs can neither condemn nor approve Setha's choice, right? And the fact that that's Baby Suggs' judgment, I think, carries a lot of weight for us as a readers, right? And so, so I think Baby Suggs is really important in that way, as a kind of ethical core or ethical center of the novel. And then Setha, of course, is the woman, who has the traumatic past, who has done this, made this terrible choice, terrible in the sense of, being forced into this position. And we get a lot of her, a lot of the story is really told through her perspective. And so we kind of live with her so much, and I think a lot of the power of the novel comes from that. And then I go back to what I said about Denver, as you know, this other track in which Morrison explores many of the same kind of thematic things, and then gives us this idea of some kind of hope at the end. And the other thing I would say is that Morrison, one of the other sort of really powerful features of this novel is Morrison's ability to sort of plausibly occupy the consciousness of really disparate characters, and characters with really different situations, and do that in this way of kind of letting us participate in that consciousness, and giving us a kind of richer sense of this whole community, to go back to Koritha's comment earlier.
Yeah, generational story is really, really a crucial one here, right? What I always think about is the fact that because Baby Suggs could neither approve or condemn, that is the reason why she ends up, well, no, that's not the reason. She had done everything right, and the white people came anyway, is the thing that breaks Baby Suggs, right? She goes into pondering color because the white people came anyway. They came in her yard anyway, so that there's no safety. You make that new house, you make that new home, and there's still no safety. So the generational question brings me to this moment. And here I'm on 287. But this links all of the generations in precisely the way that Jim was just describing. Let's see. They got me out of jail, Setha once told Baby Suggs. So Setha is giving us reasons why white people are not so bad. They got me out of jail, Setha told Baby Suggs. They also put you in it, she answered. They drove you across the river on my son's back. They gave you this house. They gave you a house, Baby Suggs. Like, what's up? They gave you a house. Nobody gave me nothing. I got a job from them. That's Setha again. He got a cook from them, girl. Oh, some of them do us all right. And every time it's a surprise, ain't it? And then I'll skip a little bit. And here we have Denver thinking about whether she's going to go out and make that new life that Jim was just talking about. About your mother's feet, not to speak of her back. I never told you all that. Is that why you can't walk down the steps? My Jesus, my. But you said there was no defense. So this is Baby Suggs' spirit speaking to Denver. You said there was no defense. How can you expect that I'm going to go down these steps? You said there was no defense. There ain't. Then what do I do? Know it and go out the yard, go on. So there is no defense, but you still got to go on. So that for me is the generational thing that the question and Jim's comments brought to mind for me immediately. Thank you for that. That was great.
Our next question is from David. Could you comment on the section about 3/4 of the way through the novel when the prose point of view shifts from omniscient narrator to an internal dialogue, where first Setha and then Beloved and Denver each speak from their own point of view, and each says, she is, or you are mine. It was such a dramatic shift in narration. Was this character development to give us more insight into each character?
This is definitely Jim's territory, all you.
Well, I think it's, one of the things that Morrison is doing throughout the whole novel is playing with voices, right? So we have the kind of dialogue that Koritha was uh, quoting there. We have Stampede goes to the door of 124 and he can't knock because he hears all these voices inside, right? And there is this effort, I think, on Morrison's part to give us to give voice to these women characters, right? Then I think in that section, right, it's really hard to read and feel like you're tracking, you know, who's the I, and you know what's going on and so on. But I think there's a couple things that help me try to make sense of it. One is there's the continuation of this idea of voices, and we get each of the characters, Setha, Denver, and Beloved, gets to articulate her thoughts and feelings, right? And that's important. Then second, I think what she's trying to do is give us a sense of the interconnections among the three of them, right? I am beloved and she is mine, and especially with Setha's feeling of this kind of merging that she's doing with Beloved, which I think we're also asked to see as problematic. But also, I think when in the Beloved section, there's also this further complication of who is beloved, right? And because a lot of that is intelligible in terms of a middle passage experience. And so I think Morrison is sort of doing all these things. And I don't think there's an easy sort of way to say, okay, in this sentence, this is exactly what's happened. In this paragraph, that's exactly what happened. But she's going for something sort of more kind of the total impression of it. And again, I think it's a significant move, right? To, if you think about Morrison as her techniques in the novel, right? She has this narrator who moves from 1987 to 1855 to 1873, and who moves across the consciousnesses of the characters. Just about, you know, every main character, we get perspectives. We get their perspectives on things, and then in this place, she gives up that narrator entirely and turns it over to the characters, and it's quite, you know, quite powerful, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add to that is I think everything you're describing gets to the way that I think, you know, what you were saying earlier about how there is an ethical choice and ethical dilemma at the core of this. And I think that part of what you just described for us as we contend with a section like that is a refusal to offer a kind of mastery, right? Yeah. That there's not going to be that narrator that allows you to feel like you have mastery over the experiences that are being represented in this text. This is a place where you're not going to just hold them captive even as characters. Yeah. I am going to continue to trouble this idea of mastery and easy understanding, and I completely understand it, and boom, I can put this in a little box. I think it's that refusal of mastery. Yeah.
And Ileana had a comment to add as well. That whole section is also part of the erotic tension between the three of them, the repetition of she is mine, Setha and her daughters claiming each other, which also connects to the hot thing imagery in this section as well. The hot thing of maternal connection, the body, the erotic of a mother.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Just endorse that. Yeah, thanks, Ileana. Yeah. Good reading.
And Jim, Susan wanted to clarify, what do you mean by middle passage?
Oh, well, I mean, that's the sort of the shorthand for the slave trade, right? And the you know, importation of slaves by on ships, right, from Africa, sometimes to Europe and from there to the United States or just directly to the United States, and so on. And, Morrison's dedication to 60 million and more is acknowledgement of the cost of that slave trade and the lives lost and the concept. I mean, I don't think anybody's ever said there's 60 million lives directly, but that if you think about the consequences of that, this is how many people. The horrors of it have been visited upon.
Our next question is from Vicky. I found it so interesting that Setha mentions significant elements of her past as tiny snippets in a long list of memories, only to later explain those tiny snippets in more detail. It's like a tease that gets satisfied and fuller reward later in the narrative. Any comments?
Yeah, I think for me, it's connected to the beating back of the past. We get that right on the second page when, the narrator talks about how suddenly Setha will be struck by images of Sweet Home, right? And, so they come unbidden, right? And then I think, so there's that. I also think from Morrison's perspective as storyteller, by giving us these snippets, she is sort of dropping these little mini promises about, I'll come back to this, right? So like early on, we get Setha thinking about, what it was like to sort of trade sex for the gravestone, right? And we don't come to know what that means. There's some references to blood on her hands and so on, right? And then finally we come back to that. And then when Setha tells her story to Paul D, right, we have this kind of background, and we're able to put pieces together, and I think it adds to the power of our engagement with the story that Morrison is telling.
Tracy asked, can you speak about some of the references and comparisons to animals throughout the novel? Morrison repeatedly uses animals to portray the degradation of humans.
Yeah. I can start. There's a lot there, right? What stands out for me is sort of the interesting kind of comparison between what Koritha has already referred to, Paul D's response to Setha's story about her decision. You've got 2 legs, not 4, right? Then immediately a forest grows up between them, right? The relationship of that to Setha's overhearing school teachers' lesson about let's make a list of human characteristics and animal characteristics. And when Setha overhears that, she has this perception, this feeling of being sort of attacked by hummingbirds, right? And when school teacher and the slave catchers come into the yard, she has that same feeling, right? So there's that strong connection. And then again, at the end, when Bodwin comes, it's like this replay of school teacher and the others coming. And we get the same kind of animal imagery there, right? Now, what's interesting, I think, is that it's sort of multivalent, right? That the hummingbird imagery is like a kind of, there's some kind of connection between the human response and the feeling of the animal, the bird, right? We're sympathetic to Setha responding that way, right? But at the same time, the human versus animal characteristics, that's just abominable, right? But it's again part of the history and part of her trauma. So one last point, that in the first telling of Setha's choice, right, from the perspective of the slave catchers, one of the things that, first of all, I think that's really an amazing thing that Morrison does, to sort of leave the perspectives of the Black characters and go into the perspective of the white character. And it is this jarring thing, and we get the sense of what it was like, sort of externally, for Setha to pick up her child, right, and take the sword. But also in that section, we have school teacher sort of instructing the people who wrote with him about you wouldn't. He's blaming them because of what they did to Setha before she left, and that gets her the tree on her back, right? They beat her, they made her bleed, right? And he's blaming her. He's blaming them for having beaten her and treated her like a horse, right? A horse that if you beat it too much, it's not going to work. Right? And that's just, again, this exposure of this kind of automatic way of thinking about actual human beings. Right? So I think she's doing a lot with that. It's a great question. There's probably more to say about it, but those are some of my kind of initial thoughts.
Yeah, that's great. And I think the only thing I'll add is, this is why it's so powerful as I think through the question of, is this still the master's house? That's the reason it's so powerful that Paul D says you have 2 feet, Setha, not 4, is because in that moment, even in this new house she's trying to make, she is being treated like she was treated on the master's plantation, right? That likening her to animals. The other thing I'll add on this animal question that I find really striking, and it goes back to what I was saying about Morrison's taking a woman's perspective here, is the rooster named Mr.
Mm-hmm.
It's so clear that it's fine for the rooster to have pride. It is not fine for female beings like Setha to have pride. And that's true both, in the past and in the present when she and Paul D are trying to make a life together. One of the things that really strikes me is the community as they gather. Actually, I think I'll read it. The community as they gather. Don't tell me that I've written all the wrong page numbers down. Okay, I'll just go by memory. There's a moment where the community has come around and, Setha is being taken to jail. And the narrator says, was her head a bit too high, her back a little too straight, right? That she was not ashamed and regretful, that she had pride, that she had a sense of agency, that she had chosen on purpose. And it's a moment when we see that pride in female beings is intolerable, but even a rooster can have pride.
Right. And one of the things that's striking, just to pick up on that, is the difference between the consequences of that for Setha, right? That's one of the reasons why nobody will come to 124, and so on. But yet, then at the end, right, I said it's a replay, but one of the big differences is that the community of women is there to respond, right, and to prevent Setha from actually, murdering Bodwin, and then beloved escapes,
Yeah.
disappears. Yeah. So, but the community is really important in that, and I think Morrison, invites us to notice that contrast.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In our last few minutes here, Koritha and Jim, could you share closing thoughts about why the novel Endears?
Yeah, I just want to briefly, I think, before I get to that, throw in something that I hope we get to that we didn't, which is the double ending, in a way, right? That Setha, Paul D comes back, right? Go back to the love story that Koritha was talking about, right? And Paul D comes back, and there is this moment of kind of reunion, right? And I'm looking towards the future, right? Where Paul D corrects Setha, thinking that beloved was her best thing, and Paul D saying, "No, you're your own best thing," right? And there's that moment of hope, right? And the novel really could have ended there, right? But it doesn't, and I think it's brilliant that it doesn't. Morrison is absolutely right to go for those 2 more pages and bring it back to the present. I won't go through a detailed thing, but I will say there's this interesting sequence. It was not a story to pass on. It was not a story to pass on. This is not a story to pass on. And then beloved as the last in that sequence and last word of the novel. And I think that invites us again to think about everything that beloved has meant in this novel, in the way, slavery and everything. And this is, for you, contemporary readers, will back in the present. So then briefly, and I think that is part of why the novel endures, because of that relevance to today. Right? I think it's aesthetically magnificent, right? A lot of things that we talked about and some of the things that we didn't. You have a novelist, a very accomplished novelist at the height of her powers. And that in itself will contribute to its endurance. But I think, then the relevance, right? And we're seeing this in the summer of 2020 about, this failure of our country to reckon with its past and the need to do that. And this is a book that contributes to that, to the understanding of the trauma of slavery, of what it's done, of how it continues, and starts to challenge us to respond.
Well, and if I just directly add to that, part of what it makes me think about is the way that this text has us think about the possibility that there's something worse than having made the decision that Setha made. And a moment for that is, and I'm at the bottom of page 295, but I'll just read it. Beloved might leave before Setha could make her realize that worse than that, far worse, was what baby Suggs died of, what Ella knew, what Stamp saw, and what made Paul D. tremble. That anybody white could take your whole self for anything that came to mind. Not just work, kill, or maim you, but dirty you. Dirty you so bad you couldn't like yourself anymore. Dirty you so bad you forgot who you were and couldn't think it up. And I'll stop there. But for me, that question linking to what Jim just left us with, for me, is at the heart of why this book is so powerful, because there's something here for all of us to contend with, right? That as a nation, as you're gesturing toward this summer, Jim, right? As a nation, there's work for all of us to do. The white communities that are taught to ignore this history, but also Black communities that are made to grapple with it in certain ways. But it's so important that we recognize how we have a responsibility to ourselves and each other, not to allow what we've endured to change who we are in a fundamental way. And so it feels to me like this book can be read both in terms of needing to reckon as a nation, but also in terms of Black communities reckoning with their past and making sure that we're not doing to each other what this country has done to us, right? That we're not doing the move of, you know, Paul D counting Setha's feet. How can we continue to think through, you know, making sure that that's not how we're operating as we all deal with the trauma that has been unjustly put in our lives. So in terms of why it endures, I think it endures because Morrison is quite simply a brilliant writer who creates beautiful prose and does exactly what literature has always done, which is to, you know, convey meaning in multiple ways on multiple registers so that readers with varying degrees of power can access it, right? Readers who aren't all that, you know, critically attuned can access this novel on one level, and readers who are more critically attuned and historically, you know, informed can grasp it on another level, right? And that's what all literature does, right? That there are so many different levels. And, you know, I just echo what Jim is saying in terms of just a remarkable writer at the height of her powers. I couldn't agree more.
Koritha and Jim, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. A big virtual round of applause from me and from everyone in the audience.
It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure, definitely.
Thank you. So wanted to let everyone know that book club will be continuing this fall. We'll be reading Little Women by Louisa May Alcott next month in September, and in October we'll return to Toni Morrison with Song of Solomon. You'll receive a recording of this event and some links, including a link to Koritha's upcoming book in a couple of days. But thank you all for joining us today and spending the afternoon. We really appreciate it.